What are short rows? Where would you want to put them into your knitting? Why would you want to do them? And how do you work a wrap and turn? This piece has 28 rows from the cast on to the bind off, and I made it for comparison. It does not have any short rows. This piece also has 28 rows, and you might say, but it looks longer, Elisa. Probably by about 4 rows, and that's because it is. I worked short rows twice, once here and once here, so my edges are still the same length, 28 rows, but in the center, this piece is 4 rows longer. That comes in really handy when you're looking to shape a garment so that it fits you better. In my particular case, I'm very busty, and I add short rows into the body of my sweater so that the front has a little extra length, so it avoids that hitch up in the front that I get when I don't add short rows into my sweater that exposes more of my gut than I'd really like. Yeah, we'll just go with that. It's not my favorite. And so I added short rows. I usually add a number of short rows to give me the equivalent length to the back. So if you read my piece on my Patreon that was a public post about adding short rows, you will have seen all of my math and my method, but essentially I measure the drop from the front shoulder to the bottom hem in the front and from the shoulder to the bottom hem in the back, and I subtract the difference. In my case, it's 2 inches. 2 inches, that's a significant amount of knitting. So at my row gauge, which you have to then measure how many rows you have to the inch, so we'll just say 7. At 7 rows to the inch, I would need to add 14 rows to add 2 inches worth of knitting to the front of my sweater. But I want the seams to go together nicely at the sides. Or if I'm knitting in the round, I don't want to create a side vent or something. So what do? The answer is short rows. Short rows are where you have worked across the piece and then you secure it. You can see my little wrap and turns here because I did not clean these up on purpose. You work almost to the end, but not the end. In this case, 2 stitches. And I chose actually 3 stitches because one of them gets wrapped. I chose 3 because I want 1 out here to go into my seam, and I wanted this one to have a little bit of room away from the seam. So I chose to wrap and turn 3 stitches from the end. Usually your pattern will tell you how many stitches from the end, but if you're adding short rows to accommodate your own personal measurement, there's my reasoning behind 3 stitches from the end. 2 will also work, but you can't do it around the very edge stitch. And if you get it too close to the center, you're just making a little tiny boop in the center. So I like to do it as close to the edge as I can. And then my wrap and turns are here. And so let's talk about wrap and turn. There are many ways to do a short row. The most common, and I think also underappreciated, is the wrap and turn. What do I mean by wrap and turn? I am going to knit across. I'm starting on a knit row. There's nothing that says you have to start on a knit row. I just like to start everything from the right side, so, you know. I'm just going to knit across. We're going to pretend this is the front of my sweater. Maybe the front of a sweater for a teddy bear, but front of my sweater nonetheless. And I'm just going to knit across my row, and I am going to stop when I am 3 stitches from the end of my row. Almost there. There we are, 3 stitches from the end of the row. Just stop. I'm going to slip 1 stitch. This is my anchor stitch. Let me zoom in so you can really see me do this. I have knit to 3 stitches from the end of the row. There they are on the left. I'm leaving the yarn in the back. I'm going to slip this stitch as if to purl, and then I'm going to turn everything around, and I'm going to take the yarn between the needles to the back side, and I'm going to slip that stitch again as if to purl. Now I'm going to bring the yarn forward, and I'm going to purl until I am 3 stitches from the other side. Almost. Okay, 3 stitches from the other end. I am going to leave my yarn in the working position, so in this case forward. I'm going to slip a stitch purlwise. I'm going to move the yarn, turn everything over, slip that stitch back to the right. See how the yarn is going around the stitch? And then move the yarn to the back side, and I'm going to knit again. And I'm going to knit until I get back to the wrapped stitch. And this is what I'm going to show you, is how to hide the wraps, because in my previous wrap and turns, I did not hide the wraps, and they leave what looks like a purl bump on the front. And there's nothing truly wrong with that, but it does distort the appearance of your stockinette. So if you don't want that to happen, you need to hide the wraps. And there are a couple of different ways you can hide the wraps. The easiest way to hide the wrap is to knit it together with the stitch that it wraps. So here I come back to 3 stitches from the end, and you can tell I've hit my wrapped stitch because it's pulling itself away from the other 2. I'm going to zoom back in. This wrap is what I need to hide. And frankly, I don't care what the wrong side of my work looks like. I want the right side, the knit side, to be correct. So what I want to do is I want to get that wrap off of the knit side. And to do that, I'm going to take my knitting needle, my right hand knitting needle, and I'm going to slide it underneath that wrap and pick it up. And then I'm going to go into the stitch, and I'm going to knit, and I'm going to pull it back through the stitch and the wrap, and just knit them together, and then knit to the end of my row. Now I don't have that wrap. It's hidden back behind in my purl side back here. So now let's see what happens when we come to the other side, when we pick up the wrap from the wrap and turn on the purl side. I'm going to purl to the end. Well, 3 stitches from the end, you know, to my previous wrap and turn. When you are deciding where to put your short rows, you want to keep in mind that unless you are trying to create a pocket or a space in your knitting like you would for a heel, you don't want to put them close together. Let's see, here I am. There is my wrapped stitch. If I turn it over, you can see that wrap hanging out there around the purl. And I know it's my wrapped stitch because I'm 3 stitches from the end. When I purl these together, unlike when I did the knit side and I came through from here, if I pick up the wrap from the purl side, I'm going to throw that wrap onto the knit side, and that's not what I want at all. And when you purl, you go this way into the stitch anyhow. So the trick is that you go under the wrap and then into the stitch, purl, and pull them both together, and it pulls that wrap to the back side, and you finish your row. What the wrap does is it anchors the turn against the stitch beside it, right here. So now this area in the middle of my piece has 2 more rows than these stitches at the outside edge. It's a sneaky way to add length without changing the overall seam length. I kind of like the way the wrap and turns look, but some people find them to be kind of fiddly. And I think honestly, most of the objection people have to the wrap and turns is not knowing how to properly hide that turn. You can see the unhidden one here. It really doesn't look that great. but up here it's not too bad. And as you wear it and tension gets applied to it, it really just disappears into the work. What I meant when I was talking about where to place the short rows is that if you put them right together, you're going to get this pooch in your knitting that works perfectly great if you're trying to get a pocket for a heel. But in your sweater, unless you're particularly looking for an appendage pocket, it might not be the best solution. So when I'm planning where to put them in the body of my sweater, let's just pretend that this is my underarm and this is the top of my ribbing. You don't want to work short rows in the ribbing unless there's a particular reason for it, like a shawl collar. That's a good reason to work short rows in a ribbing. But if you're just talking about the bottom of your sweater, I usually leave that alone. I don't add increases, I don't do any short rows, I don't do anything fancy. And then I like to work a little bit beyond my ribbing before I begin putting in short rows. And I don't want the very last short row to be right here before I begin the underarm bind off. So if you measure how much distance that is, and clearly this one's about 4 inches, and really you're talking more like 15 inches, measure that distance, divide it by the number of sets of short rows. And what I mean by a set of short rows is each time you work a short row, you go here and back, and then resume working back and forth across the whole piece. When you go here and back across a short area, it adds 2 rows into this area only. And so each time you work a set of short rows, you are working a knit row and a purl row, it adds 2 rows to the total. So in my example of wanting to add 14 rows to my knitting, I would need to work a short row 7 times. So take your total distance, divide it by the number of sets of short rows you have to work, and then separate your short rows out. I usually use a stitch marker to mark them so I can find them easily. And I just knit, let's say I'm knitting every 1.5 inches. Call it 10 rows. 10 rows is pretty easy. That's pretty close to 1.5 inches at 7 rows to the inch. And so I would put a stitch marker here in this last short row that I worked, and then I would count 10 rows beyond it before I would work short rows again. I like working short rows to accommodate the rise in the front of my sweater. I have worked them in the shoulder area on the back to accommodate stooped shoulders without changing the armhole depth. I have worked them to accommodate a hunchback on a dear friend who was a childhood polio survivor. I have used short rows in all kinds of creative ways. And then, of course, there are all these beautiful shawls out there that incorporate short rows for some really dynamic design. And learning how to work different kinds of short rows is a real benefit to your knitting toolbox. So this is the Wrap and Turn. I will have further videos for students and patrons on other methods of working short rows. And I hope to see you soon in a class or as a patron or somewhere on the internets. Have a great day.